On January 16, 1979, after mounting protests, strikes, and factional violence that had engulfed Iran for more than a year, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Western-aligned monarch whose reign had been sustained in part by decades of American political, military, and economic support, fled his country into exile, leaving in his wake a fractured polity and an ascendant revolutionary coalition centered on the clerical figure of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, whose return from French exile on February 1, 1979, marked the consolidation of revolutionary authority and the beginning of a theocratic state that would redefine Iran's international posture and rupture its relationship with the United States. The U.S. diplomatic presence in Tehran, once staffed by more than 1,000 officials operating with relative security and access, had been reduced to a skeletal mission in the face of intensifying anti-American demonstrations and attacks earlier in the year, and when the United States, under President Jimmy Carter, agreed in October to admit the deposed Shah for cancer treatment, a decision informed by human rights concerns about his deteriorating health, but understood by Iranian revolutionaries as a final act of Western interventionism. It catalyzed existing resentment into a crisis that would soon envelop both capitals in a protracted standoff, rooted in competing visions of sovereignty, revolution, and global influence. On November 4, 1979, in the prelude to what would become the Iran Hostage Crisis, a large contingent of militant students identifying themselves as the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, who were committed to the principles articulated by Khomeini and determined to expel perceived imperialist influence from Iranian soil, stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran, scaling the embassy gates and overwhelming the diminished guard force, seizing diplomats and other American personnel in a coordinated assault that effectively turned the embassy compound into a fortified compound under their control, and signaling a dramatic escalation in revolutionary activity that defied not only the decrepit provisional government of Iran, but also the institutional norms of international diplomacy and sovereign immunity that had governed relations between states since the end of the Second World War. This action, which resulted in the capture of 66 Americans, including diplomats, intelligence officers, and support staff, was framed by its perpetrators as both retribution for decades of interventionist U.S. policy, dating back through the Cold War into the 1953 overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and as a bold assertion of Iran's new revolutionary identity. And although 13 hostages, primarily women and African Americans, were released within the first weeks, a core group of 52 remained in captivity, held under conditions of psychological strain and isolation that would persist for 444 days, dominating international headlines and transforming what might otherwise have been a regional political upheaval into a diplomatic catastrophe that laid bare the limits of American influence and the volatility of post-colonial state formation in the late Cold War period. In response to the embassy takeover, the Carter administration quickly moved to impose punitive measures that included freezing Iranian state assets in the United States through Executive Order 12170 and barring Iranian imports, steps designed to exert economic pressure and signal resolve. But these actions only hardened Iranian intransigence and highlighted the paralysis within Washington as policymakers debated the utility of sanctions versus negotiation in a crisis that had already defied conventional diplomatic channels. Within days of the embassy's capture, Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan's moderate provisional government resigned in protest, leaving the Revolutionary Council and Khomeini's inner circle unchallenged in their control of Iranian affairs and removing any institutional interlocutors with whom the United States might negotiate. even as President Carter dispatched emissaries in an effort to secure the hostages' release. Emissaries who were rebuffed, and whose failure underscored the shifting balance of power inside Iran and the marginalization of moderate forces that might have tempered the situation. By late November 1979, the United Nations Security Council had adopted a resolution calling for the immediate release of the hostages, and the United States had launched an international legal suit against Iran in the International Court of Justice for violations of diplomatic law. But these multilateral mechanisms yielded little tangible progress as the hostage-takers sharpened their demands, which included the extradition of the Shah to Iran to face justice and guarantees against future U.S. interference in Iranian internal affairs, demands that the American government, constrained by constitutional protections, fears for the Shah's safety, and the absence of leverage, was unable and unwilling to meet. As 1980 dawned and the crisis entered its fifth month, Washington's strategic calculus shifted amid mounting domestic political pressure, as the protracted standoff became an enduring symbol of American impotence, eroding Carter's credibility both at home and abroad. And on April 7, 1980, the United States formally severed diplomatic relations with Iran, a break that reflected not only the acute rupture caused by the hostage situation, but also the broader collapse of bilateral diplomatic architecture that had governed U.S.-Iran relations since the early years of the Cold War, leaving no formal mechanism for dialogue and relegating negotiations to back-channel intermediaries. In late April 1980, with negotiations stalemated and public impatience at a fevered pitch, the Carter administration approved a military rescue attempt codenamed Operation Eagle Claw, a joint special operations mission involving helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft staging toward a desert rendezvous point east of Tehran, with the intention of infiltrating the city and extracting the hostages by force. But the operation ended in disaster when mechanical failures and adverse weather forced the mission to abort, resulting in a collision that killed 8 American servicemen and further punctuated the narrative of American vulnerability and strategic miscalculation in the crisis that now stretched into months without resolution. As the crisis unfolded through the spring and summer of 1980, Iran itself was undergoing further internal transformation, with elections and constitutional consolidation affirming the revolutionary government's authority. While internationally, the standoff complicated U.S. Cold War priorities at a time when strategic attention was focused on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and intensifying superpower competition elsewhere, forcing policymakers in Washington to balance the imperative of resolving the hostage situation against the broader demands of containment strategy. In the autumn of 1980, secret negotiations brokered through Algerian intermediaries began to take shape, with Iranian conditions for the release of the hostages crystallizing around demands for the unfreezing of Iranian assets, the termination of U.S. legal claims, and assurances of non-interference, propositions that reflected both revolutionary ideology and pragmatic concerns about economic stability. And though the Shah died in exile in Cairo on July 27, 1980, a development that removed one of the original catalysts of the crisis, the standoff continued to dominate the final months of the 1980 U.S. presidential election, contributing to Jimmy Carter's defeat and embedding the hostage issue deeply into American domestic politics. Ultimately, after protracted Algerian-mediated diplomacy that kept both capitals engaged, even as public, impatience and political violence gyrated around them. Iran and the United States signed the Algiers Accords on January 19, 1981, an agreement that provided for the release of the 52 remaining hostages on January 20, 1981, mere minutes after Ronald Reagan's inauguration, in exchange for unfreezing Iranian assets and the creation of claims mechanisms designed to address financial disputes, bringing to a close one of the most protracted and humiliating chapters of Cold War diplomacy, and leaving a legacy of mutual distrust that would shape U.S. Middle Eastern policy for decades to come, but never fully restore the diplomatic relationship that had been shattered in the revolutionary fervor of late 1979 and early 1981. The release of the American hostages on January 20th, 1981, did not mark a resolution so much as a transition, closing the most visible phase of the crisis while entrenching the deeper structural rupture between Iran and the United States that had emerged during the final years of the Carter administration, and as the aircraft carrying the former captives departed Tehran airspace, the geopolitical consequences of the episode were already crystallizing across multiple arenas of the Cold War system, beginning with Washington itself, where the humiliation of prolonged captivity, failed diplomacy, and the abortive rescue attempt had reshaped institutional attitudes toward Iran and reinforced a broader perception of declining American leverage in regions undergoing revolutionary change. For the outgoing administration of Jimmy Carter, the crisis represented the terminal collapse of a foreign policy approach that emphasized moral legitimacy, multilateralism, and restraint, as internal postmortems within the State Department and National Security Council concluded that the United States had been strategically unprepared for the velocity and ideological intensity of Iran's revolution, misreading both the depth of anti-American sentiment and the extent to which revolutionary actors were willing to violate international norms to consolidate domestic authority, assessments that would inform a harder-edged posture under the incoming administration of Ronald Reagan, even as Reagan's advisors inherited a bilateral relationship in which formal diplomatic ties had been severed, assets remained contested, and communication depended on intermediaries whose influence fluctuated with regional conditions. In Tehran, the crisis had served its intended domestic function, empowering the clerical establishment around Ruhollah Khomeini by marginalizing secular and moderate factions, legitimizing extraordinary security measures, and embedding anti-Americanism as a foundational pillar of the Islamic Republic's political identity, with the embassy seizure retrospectively reframed as a revolutionary triumph that exposed Western vulnerability and validated the narrative of Iran as a state resisting imperial domination, a narrative that continued to be reinforced through official commemorations, educational materials, and state media well after the hostages' departure. The institutionalization of this posture was reflected in the restructuring of Iran's security apparatus, as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps expanded its remit beyond internal defense to include regional influence operations, while the regular military, previously aligned with the Shah, was purged and subordinated to revolutionary oversight, a reconfiguration that altered Iran's strategic behavior during subsequent confrontations and positioned it as an unpredictable actor within the Cold War's peripheral theaters. Internationally, the hostage crisis accelerated a reorientation of U.S. policy in the Persian Gulf, where the loss of Iran as a strategic partner prompted Washington to deepen ties with conservative Arab monarchies and to articulate a more explicit commitment to the region's security, culminating in doctrinal statements that framed external threats to Gulf stability as threats to vital American interests, a shift that reflected both the perceived vacuum left by Iran's estrangement and the growing importance of energy security in the late 20th century global economy. The Soviet Union, for its part, observed the crisis with a mixture of caution and opportunity, recognizing that while Iran's revolutionary leadership was ideologically hostile to both superpowers, the erosion of American influence along the Soviet Union's southern periphery created strategic ambiguity that Moscow sought to exploit through limited diplomatic engagement and rhetorical support for anti-imperialist movements. Even as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 complicated these efforts by reinforcing Iranian suspicions of foreign intervention and constraining any possibility of alignment. Within the broader Cold War context, the crisis underscored the limits of superpower control over revolutionary movements in the post-colonial world, illustrating how local actors could manipulate global rivalries to advance their own agendas while resisting incorporation into either bloc, a lesson that resonated in Washington and Moscow alike, as policymakers reassessed the risks of intervention and the reliability of client states. Economically, the Algiers Accords established mechanisms that would govern U.S.-Iranian financial disputes for decades, including the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal, which processed thousands of claims arising from the severance of commercial relationships and the freezing of assets, embedding the crisis within a dense legal framework that persisted even in the absence of diplomatic relations and served as one of the few structured channels of interaction between the two states. Domestically within the United States, the political aftershocks of the hostage crisis extended beyond Carter's electoral defeat, shaping public perceptions of executive authority, crisis, management, and national resolve, as media coverage of the hostages' captivity had created an unprecedented cycle of daily reporting that fused foreign policy failure with domestic anxiety, reinforcing demands for a more assertive posture abroad and contributing to the broader ideological shift that characterized American politics in the early 1980s. In Iran, the memory of the crisis became inseparable from the consolidation of the Islamic Republic, with the narrative of resistance against American pressure used to justify continued vigilance against internal dissent and external engagement, even as the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War in September 1980 redirected national focus toward survival and territorial defense, temporarily subsuming the hostage episode within a larger narrative of existential struggle. Yet the legacy of the crisis endured in the mutual absence of trust, as subsequent attempts at limited rapprochement were constrained by the precedent of 1979-1981, with American officials viewing Iran through the lens of unpredictability and hostility, and Iranian leaders interpreting U.S. actions as inherently interventionist, a dynamic that perpetuated a cycle of suspicion and indirect confrontation across multiple arenas of the late Cold War. By the mid-1980s, the hostage crisis had assumed a canonical status in Cold War historiography as a case study in asymmetric leverage, demonstrating how a regional power undergoing revolutionary transformation could impose strategic costs on a superpower without engaging in conventional military confrontation, a pattern that would recur in other contexts as ideological movements exploited global communication networks and legal asymmetries to challenge established power structures. At the same time, the episode exposed vulnerabilities in international diplomatic norms, revealing the limited enforcement mechanisms available when state authority was fragmented or ideologically hostile to prevailing conventions. A revelation that unsettled assumptions about the stability of the post-1945 order and prompted renewed debate within international institutions about the protection of diplomatic personnel. As the Cold War progressed into its final decade, the Iranian hostage crisis remained a reference point in American strategic culture, invoked in discussions of deterrence, crisis response, and the management of hostile regimes. While in Iran, it continued to symbolize the revolutionary moment when the country asserted autonomy at the cost of international isolation, embedding a legacy that would shape decision-making long after the immediate participants had left the political stage. In this sense, the crisis did not conclude with the hostages' release, but persisted as a structural fault line within the Cold War system, influencing alignments, doctrines, and perceptions in ways that extended far beyond the confines of the embassy compound in Tehran and into the enduring architecture of late 20th century geopolitics. In the immediate years following the hostages' release, the Iranian hostage crisis settled into the strategic subconscious of the Cold War powers as both a warning and a precedent, shaping behavior even when it was not explicitly invoked. And in Washington, the experience drove an institutional recalibration that emphasized contingency planning, rapid response capabilities, and a reassertion of executive authority in foreign crises, as the failure of negotiation and the humiliation of prolonged captivity convinced policymakers that reliance on diplomatic norms alone was insufficient when confronting ideologically driven regimes willing to absorb international condemnation for domestic legitimacy. This recalibration manifested in expanded funding and doctrinal development for special operations forces, intelligence coordination reforms, and a more skeptical approach toward revolutionary governments, whose internal legitimacy derived from anti-Western mobilization rather than international recognition, a shift that reflected lessons drawn directly from the paralysis of 1979-1981, rather than from abstract Cold War theory. At the same time, the severing of U.S.-Iranian diplomatic relations created an enduring blind spot in American intelligence and policy planning, as the absence of an embassy eliminated on-the-ground reporting and forced reliance on indirect sources, increasing uncertainty and miscalculation risks during a period when the Middle East's strategic significance was rising due to energy markets, regional conflicts, and superpower competition. In Tehran, the revolutionary leadership leveraged the symbolic capital of the crisis to entrench a political culture that conflated dissent with foreign subversion, using the memory of the embassy takeover to justify expansive internal security measures and to frame opposition movements as extensions of Western interference, a posture that narrowed the space for reformist currents and reinforced a siege mentality that persisted through the 1980s. This internal consolidation was accompanied by an outward-facing strategy that balanced ideological defiance with selective pragmatism, as Iran sought to navigate a hostile international environment without formal alliances, rejecting alignment with either superpower while exploiting their rivalry to avoid isolation, a strategy that became evident as Tehran maintained rhetorical opposition to both Washington and Moscow, even as it maneuvered diplomatically to secure arms, economic relief, and political breathing room during its protracted war with Iraq. For the broader Cold War system, the hostage crisis underscored the limits of détente-era assumptions about predictability and rationality, revealing how revolutionary legitimacy could override cost-benefit calculations traditionally associated with state behavior and complicate superpower crisis management by introducing actors whose priorities were domestic and ideological rather than strategic in the conventional sense. This realization influenced U.S. and Soviet assessments of political instability across the developing world, encouraging more cautious engagement with revolutionary movements while simultaneously prompting efforts to identify and cultivate reliable regional partners capable of maintaining order and safeguarding strategic interests, even if such partnerships entailed tolerating authoritarian practices that earlier human rights-centered policies had sought to constrain. The crisis also had a lasting impact on international law and diplomatic practice, as it exposed the fragility of the Vienna Convention's protections in the face of revolutionary upheaval and raised questions about enforcement mechanisms when host states either could not or would not uphold their obligations, leading to renewed emphasis on embassy security, evacuation planning, and host nation risk assessments across foreign ministries worldwide. Within the United States, the cultural imprint of the hostage crisis persisted through the 1980s, shaping public expectations of presidential resolve and crisis leadership, and contributing to a political climate that favored decisive action over prolonged negotiation, a climate reinforced by the visual memory of blindfolded diplomats and nightly news updates that had transformed a distant embassy into a symbol of national vulnerability. This legacy influenced subsequent debates over the use of force, sanctions, and covert action, as policymakers weighed the reputational costs of perceived weakness against the risks of escalation, often invoking the lessons of Tehran even when confronting unrelated adversaries. In Iran, the episode became institutionalized as a foundational myth of the Islamic Republic, commemorated annually and embedded in educational narratives as evidence of revolutionary authenticity, a framing that ensured the crisis would remain a reference point in domestic politics, long after its immediate diplomatic relevance had faded. Despite this mutual fixation, direct confrontation between the United States and Iran remained constrained throughout the remainder of the Cold War, as both sides recognized the dangers of escalation in a region already destabilized by conflict and superpower rivalry, leading instead to a pattern of indirect engagement, signaling, and limited cooperation mediated through third parties, a pattern rooted in the structures established during the hostage crisis rather than in any subsequent rapprochement. As the Cold War drew toward its conclusion in the late 1980s, the Iranian hostage crisis stood as an emblem of a transitional era, marking the point at which the assumptions of post-war diplomacy collided with the realities of ideological revolution and regional autonomy, and demonstrating that superpower influence, while formidable, could be circumscribed by local dynamics that resisted external control. In historical retrospect, the crisis occupies a distinct place not merely as an episode of diplomatic failure, but as a structural inflection point that reshaped U.S. engagement with the Middle East, reinforced Iran's revolutionary trajectory, and illuminated the evolving nature of conflict in a world where power was increasingly contested, not only between states, but within them, a lesson that would resonate through the final years of the Cold War and inform the strategic environment that emerged in its aftermath. As the Cold War entered its final decade, the Iranian hostage crisis continued to exert a gravitational pull on policy formulation and strategic perception, functioning less as an isolated historical episode than as a persistent reference frame through which both American and Iranian decision-makers interpreted subsequent confrontations. And in Washington, the memory of Tehran informed a hardened consensus that revolutionary regimes driven by ideological legitimacy posed a qualitatively different challenge than traditional authoritarian allies or adversaries, a belief that reinforced skepticism toward engagement strategies premised on gradual normalization and instead privileged containment, pressure, and deterrence as default responses. This posture was evident in the expansion of economic sanctions regimes, the tightening of export controls, and the cultivation of regional security architectures designed to offset Iran's influence without direct military confrontation, reflecting a deliberate effort to avoid a repetition of the paralysis that had characterized the hostage period while acknowledging the limits of coercion short of war. Within the intelligence community, the absence of formal diplomatic channels with Iran after 1980 led to an increased reliance on technical collection, allied reporting, and indirect human sources, a patchwork approach that mitigated but did not eliminate uncertainty and contributed to episodic misinterpretations of Iranian intentions, reinforcing a cycle in which mistrust generated policies that further constrained information flow. In Tehran, The leadership's interpretation of the hostage crisis as a successful assertion of sovereignty hardened attitudes toward the United States as an irreconcilable adversary, embedding anti-Americanism into the constitutional and institutional fabric of the Islamic Republic, and shaping foreign policy discourse in ways that limited flexibility even when pragmatic considerations might have favored de-escalation, a rigidity that was periodically tempered by tactical adjustments but rarely by strategic reorientation. This ideological framing intersected with Iran's experience during the Iran-Iraq War, which reinforced the perception that external powers were willing to tolerate or enable aggression against the revolutionary state, thereby validating the narrative that had underpinned the embassy seizure and deepening the conviction that self-reliance and vigilance were essential to survival. Across the wider Middle East, the hostage crisis altered perceptions of American reliability and reach, prompting allies to reassess the extent to which U.S. power could be relied upon in moments of acute crisis and encouraging hedging behaviors that included diversification of security partnerships and greater emphasis on internal stability, developments that subtly reshaped regional alignments during the late Cold War, even as formal alliance structures remained intact. The episode also influenced global media dynamics, demonstrating how sustained coverage of a diplomatic crisis could amplify its political impact and constrain policy options, a lesson absorbed by both state and non-state actors who recognized the leverage inherent in controlling narratives and symbols, an insight that would be applied in various forms in subsequent international confrontations. Within international institutions, the limitations exposed by the hostage crisis prompted incremental reforms in crisis response coordination and diplomatic security practices. But the fundamental challenge of enforcing norms against non-compliant states remained unresolved, leaving a legacy of vulnerability that continued to trouble the international system as ideological conflicts intersected with state collapse and revolutionary upheaval. By the late 1980s, as superpower tensions eased and the Cold War's bipolar structure began to erode, the Iranian hostage crisis appeared increasingly anomalous in its intensity and duration. Yet its lessons remained salient precisely because it had occurred at the intersection of declining imperial influence, rising revolutionary movements, and global media saturation, a convergence that foreshadowed the complexities of the post-Cold War era. For historians and strategists alike, the crisis came to be understood not merely as a failure of American diplomacy or an excess of revolutionary zeal, but as a structural confrontation between competing conceptions of legitimacy, one rooted in international law and state sovereignty, the other in revolutionary authenticity and popular mobilization, a confrontation that neither side could resolve without undermining its own foundational principles. This structural incompatibility explains why the crisis resisted quick resolution despite overwhelming disparities in material power, and why its effects lingered long after the hostages' release, shaping patterns of interaction that persisted even as global circumstances changed. As the Cold War drew to a close, the Iranian hostage crisis stood as a reminder that the era's defining conflicts were not confined to nuclear standoffs or proxy wars, but also unfolded in the realm of symbols, norms, and legitimacy, where outcomes were determined as much by perception and narrative as by force, and where the consequences of a single dramatic act could reverberate across decades, altering the trajectory of states and the structure of international relations in ways that defied conventional strategic logic. By the time the Cold War approached its terminal phase in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Iranian hostage crisis had become embedded in the strategic memory of the international system as a case study in how revolutionary legitimacy could override the conventional constraints of power politics, And this embedded memory influenced not only bilateral relations between Iran and the United States, but also the broader assumptions governing crisis management in an increasingly fragmented global order. In Washington, the end of the Cold War did not bring a corresponding reassessment of Iran rooted in reconciliation or normalization, because the foundational rupture created between 1979 and 1981 had institutionalized Iran as a distinct category of adversary, one defined less by its material capabilities than by its ideological posture and willingness to defy international norms, a categorization that survived the collapse of the Soviet Union and shaped policy continuity across successive administrations, regardless of shifting global alignments. This continuity reflected the degree to which the hostage crisis had fused emotional, political, and strategic dimensions into a single narrative of betrayal and humiliation, one that constrained diplomatic imagination and narrowed the range of acceptable policy responses even as geopolitical conditions evolved. In Iran, the consolidation of revolutionary identity through the crisis produced a parallel rigidity, as leaders who had risen to power by framing the embassy seizure as a moral and political victory faced strong internal incentives to preserve that narrative, lest any softening toward the United States be interpreted as a repudiation of the revolution's foundational moment, a dynamic that ensured the crisis would remain a touchstone in internal debates over legitimacy, authority, and resistance. The endurance of these narratives on both sides meant that the crisis functioned as a self-reinforcing barrier to rapprochement. With each new dispute interpreted through the lens of past grievance, and each attempt at engagement viewed with suspicion born of historical experience. Analytically, the hostage crisis revealed the asymmetry inherent in confrontations between established powers and revolutionary states, demonstrating how actors with limited material resources could impose disproportionate political and reputational costs by targeting symbols of authority and exploiting the normative constraints under which powerful states operated, a dynamic that challenged the prevailing Cold War assumption that power asymmetries translated reliably into political leverage. This asymmetry was compounded by the role of global media, which transformed the embassy takeover into a prolonged spectacle that amplified its psychological impact and constrained policy flexibility, forcing decision-makers to operate under constant public scrutiny and reinforcing the tendency toward caution and incrementalism that characterized the American response. For scholars of international relations, the crisis thus became a reference point in debates over deterrence, signaling, and the limits of coercive diplomacy, illustrating how traditional tools of statecraft could falter when confronted with actors whose utility calculations were shaped by domestic legitimacy rather than external incentives. Within the Middle East, the episode contributed to a gradual reconfiguration of power relationships, as regional actors recalibrated their expectations of American intervention and explored alternative strategies for securing autonomy within a volatile environment, developments that unfolded unevenly but collectively eroded the assumption of unchallenged Western dominance that had characterized the immediate post-war decades. The crisis also influenced the evolution of U.S. military doctrine, reinforcing the perceived need for rapid, decisive capabilities that could respond to crises without prolonged exposure to diplomatic paralysis, a perception that informed investments in force projection and special operations, even as policymakers remained wary of repeating the miscalculations of Operation Eagle Claw. At the same time, the experience underscored the risks inherent in such capabilities, reminding planners that technical superiority could not compensate for intelligence gaps, environmental uncertainties, and the political costs of failure. lessons that would resonate in later interventions beyond the Cold War's temporal boundaries. In Iran, the institutional legacy of the crisis manifested in a foreign policy culture that prioritized strategic patience and indirect engagement, favoring proxy relationships, ideological messaging, and incremental influence over overt confrontation. A pattern that allowed Tehran to navigate a hostile international environment while avoiding direct clashes that could threaten regime survival. This approach, rooted in the lessons of revolutionary confrontation with a superpower, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of asymmetry and endurance that contrasted with the more rigid bloc politics of earlier Cold War decades. As historians assess the crisis in the context of the Cold War's conclusion, it became increasingly clear that its significance lay not in any immediate strategic realignment, but in its demonstration of how global power structures could be disrupted by localized acts of defiance that resonated far beyond their point of origin, altering perceptions, doctrines, and relationships in ways that outlasted the formal end of ideological rivalry. The Iranian Hostage Crisis thus stands as a boundary event within Cold War history, occurring at the intersection of declining bipolar discipline and rising revolutionary autonomy, and revealing fault lines that would become more pronounced as the international system moved toward a more diffuse and contested configuration. In this sense, the crisis did not merely expose the limits of American influence in Iran, but illuminated a broader transformation in the nature of global conflict, one in which legitimacy, narrative, and endurance increasingly rivaled material power as determinants of outcome, a transformation that reshaped the strategic landscape as the Cold War drew to a close and left an enduring imprint on the world that followed. In its final analytical balance, the Iranian hostage crisis occupies a singular position within Cold War history because it unfolded not as a conventional proxy war, intelligence contest, or superpower standoff, but as a sustained confrontation over legitimacy, sovereignty, and the enforceability of international order at a moment when the post-war system was already under strain. And by the time the crisis had fully receded into history, its deeper significance had become clearer as a structural demonstration of how revolutionary states could impose strategic costs on materially superior powers without engaging in direct military conflict. The seizure of the U.S. Embassy and the prolonged captivity of American diplomats exposed the vulnerability of a system that depended on mutual adherence to diplomatic norms, revealing that when those norms were rejected on ideological grounds, the mechanisms available to enforce compliance were limited, slow, and often politically counterproductive, a reality that unsettled assumptions across the Cold War world about predictability and control. For the United States, the crisis marked the definitive end of the pre-1979 Iran policy framework, dismantling decades of strategic partnership in a matter of months and replacing it with a posture defined by distance, pressure, and mistrust. A posture that endured because it was reinforced not only by strategic calculation, but by institutional memory, political symbolism, and the personal experiences of policymakers whose careers had been shaped by the humiliation of Tehran. This endurance ensured that even as the Cold War's ideological polarity dissolved, the bilateral rupture persisted, demonstrating that some conflicts born of the Cold War were not resolved by its conclusion, but instead carried forward into the new international environment it left behind. For Iran, the crisis functioned as a crucible in which revolutionary authority was tested and validated, allowing the clerical leadership to assert control over competing factions, redefine national identity around resistance, and establish a governing narrative in which defiance of American power was not reckless provocation but historical necessity, a narrative that justified sacrifice, isolation, and vigilance as the price of sovereignty. This internal consolidation, achieved in part through confrontation, shaped Iran's subsequent behavior in ways that were often misinterpreted abroad as irrational or aggressive, when in fact they reflected a strategic culture forged under conditions of perceived encirclement and existential threat. At the systemic level, the hostage crisis revealed the growing importance of non-material dimensions of power within the late Cold War order, illustrating how symbolism, media exposure, and ideological mobilization could constrain even the most capable states, not by defeating them militarily, but by eroding their freedom of action and imposing reputational costs that reverberated through domestic politics and alliance relationships. This lesson resonated beyond U.S.-Iranian relations, influencing how states approached crises involving insurgencies, revolutionary movements, and non-state actors, and contributing to a broader reassessment of how power operated in a world where legitimacy could be as decisive as force. The crisis also underscored the asymmetry between risk tolerance in revolutionary and established states, showing that actors whose survival depended on ideological authenticity could accept levels of isolation and pressure that liberal democracies found politically unsustainable, thereby inverting traditional assumptions about leverage and coercion. In this inversion lay one of the most consequential insights of the episode, as it demonstrated that the ability to endure pressure could itself become a form of power, particularly when combined with a narrative capable of transforming hardship into proof of resolve. As the Cold War ended, the Iranian hostage crisis remained a reference point precisely because it defied the era's dominant frameworks, resisting classification as either a superpower confrontation or a peripheral disturbance, and instead standing as evidence that the international system was already evolving toward a more fragmented and contested configuration in which authority, identity, and narrative played increasingly central roles. The legacy of the crisis thus extends beyond the confines of U.S.-Iranian hostility, offering a window into the transitional dynamics that characterized the late Cold War and foreshadowed the challenges of the post-bipolar world. In historical retrospect, its significance lies not in the tactical details of negotiation or the failure of a single rescue mission, but in its exposure of systemic vulnerabilities, its redefinition of strategic patience, and its demonstration that the Cold War's most enduring consequences were sometimes forged not on battlefields or in summit rooms, but in prolonged confrontations where time, legitimacy, and perception proved more decisive than firepower. The Iranian hostage crisis, in this sense, stands as one of the Cold War's defining boundary events, marking the moment when the assumptions of post-war order collided with the realities of revolutionary politics, and in doing so, revealing a world already moving beyond the structures that had defined the conflict for more than 4 decades.